Tiana Williams stood at the edge of the school parking lot, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the students spill into the building.
Get back here! We're gonna get you!
It was the first day of her
can't
junior
escape.
year at Buchanan High School, and everything felt foreign: the faces,
Hey, come
the
on!
voices,
Wait!
the classrooms. It wasn't just the new school or the unfamiliar city that had her stomach tied in knots, it was the sense of being invisible, like a piece of her was already lost in the shuffle. Her family had moved from Richmond to this small town in North Carolina a few weeks ago. Her mother had found a new job, and T's father had recently been transferred with his work. Change was never easy, especially when it meant leaving behind the only home she had ever known. T tried to remind herself that it wasn't all bad, maybe this could be a fresh start, a chance to blend in and forget her past. But the truth was, she didn't want to be invisible. She just didn't know how to be anything else. Her uniform, simple jeans and a loose sweater was the least of her worries. She had tried to keep her appearance low-key, hoping no one would notice how different she felt. What she didn't want to be was noticed, to be called out as the new girl. She had always hated that label. It made her feel like she had a target on her back. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her mother: "Good luck today, T. Don't forget to eat lunch. I love you." T smiled slightly, her fingers tracing the edge of the phone's screen. Her mom had always been supportive, always encouraging her to stand up for herself. But T wasn't sure how to stand up when she felt so small, so alone. The idea of fitting in was harder than it seemed, especially when you didn't quite know who you were supposed to be. Taking a deep breath, T walked toward the school entrance, keeping her head down. She felt the familiar weight of her karate uniform under her clothes, her black belt wrapped around her waist, hidden away. It was the one thing in her life she had always been proud of, the one thing that made her feel strong. But she never talked about it. People didn't need to know. Not here. Not in this new world where she was just another face in the crowd. By the time T arrived at her first class, the school was already buzzing with energy. She slid into a seat in the back of the classroom, grateful for the anonymity. It felt safer there, away from the groups of students who were already chatting and laughing. She could hear their voices blending together, like a cacophony of sound that she couldn't quite tune out. Her teacher, Mr. Williams, a middle-aged man with round glasses, stood at the front of the room and introduced himself. T only half listened, her thoughts drifting back to the day ahead. The thought of gym class made her stomach churn. She had never liked sports, and she wasn't great at them either. Not like some of the other kids, who seemed to glide effortlessly from one activity to the next. She had always been the quiet one, the one who sat on the sidelines. She couldn't remember the last time she had really felt confident. Even in karate, where she excelled, she kept it a secret. She had never wanted to stand out. People didn't expect much from her, and that was fine by her. She didn't want to disappoint them by showing that she was more than they thought. As the bell rang and the students shuffled out into the hallway, T kept her head low, following the flow of the crowd. She found her next class without incident, the rhythm of the day slowly becoming a blur. But as she entered the gym for her first physical education class, everything changed. The moment she stepped through the door, the chatter died down for just a second. It was only a second, but it was enough. She knew what it meant. The new girl. Her heart skipped a beat. "Look who finally decided to show up," a voice called out from the bleachers. T's eyes immediately found the source, Cassie, a tall, blonde girl with a confident smirk and a sharp gaze. She sat with a group of her friends, their laughter echoing off the gym walls. T's palms felt clammy, but she didn't look up, didn't acknowledge them. She moved to the side, silently hoping that if she kept her distance, they would forget about her. But Cassie wasn't finished. "Hey, new girl," she called again, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You look like you don't belong here. This isn't Richmond, is it?" T felt a pang of embarrassment. She couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her as she quickly changed into her gym clothes and sat near the back of the room. She hated being the center of attention. Hated the feeling of being scrutinized like she was some specimen under a microscope. Cassie's voice cut through the air again. "You're so quiet. Did you forget how to talk, or are you just shy?" Her friends giggled, and T's cheeks burned. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't good at fighting back, and the truth was, she didn't want to make things worse. She just wanted to survive the day and go home. The coach, a burly man with a whistle hanging around his neck, clapped his hands together. "All right, everyone. Let's get moving. We're doing some warm-up exercises today." T tried to focus on the stretches, hoping to disappear into the rhythm of the class. She wasn't great at physical activities. She could do karate, yes, but when it came to things like running laps or jumping jacks, she always felt awkward. Her mind was on autopilot, until she heard Cassie's voice again. "Hey, look at T," Cassie said loudly. "She looks like she's never done a push-up in her life." T winced, but she didn't respond. It was easier to stay silent than to say something that might just make things worse. But then, to her surprise, Cassie stood up and walked over to her. "I bet you can't even do one, can you? What kind of girl doesn't know how to do a push-up?" Her friends snickered, their eyes trained on T like hawks. T felt a lump form in her throat, and for a brief moment, the world around her seemed to slow down. Her heart hammered in her chest. She could feel the heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck, but she couldn't just let this go on. She couldn't stay silent forever. For a second, she considered standing up for herself, but then the self-doubt crept in. What if they laughed at her? What if she embarrassed herself? Her hands shook slightly as she looked around at the group, wondering if anyone would come to her defense. But no one did. Cassie's friends were all watching, waiting for her to falter. T took a deep breath. She could feel the familiar tension in her body, the same one she had felt many times before in karate class when her sensei challenged her to push beyond her limits. But this was different. This wasn't karate, and Cassie wasn't an opponent she could outmaneuver with a well-placed kick. She glanced at the floor, then back up at Cassie. "I'm not here to prove anything to you," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, but firm enough that Cassie's smirk faltered. For a moment, there was silence. And then Cassie laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Whatever, new girl. Keep hiding behind your quiet little act. It's not gonna work here." As Cassie turned to walk back to her group, T's heart continued to race. She wasn't sure if she had won or lost, but at least she had said something. At least she hadn't completely retreated. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to stand her ground. Slowly, she began to realize that she wasn't going to survive this high school year by staying quiet. She didn't have to be loud, but she had to be something more than invisible. The day wasn't over yet, and already, she could feel the seeds of conflict growing. Would she continue to retreat, or would she finally let her true strength shine through? T walked through the school hallways with her head down, trying to make herself as small as possible. It was the only way she knew how to survive, staying unnoticed, slipping through the cracks, keeping her distance from the relentless group of bullies that seemed to have made her their target. It had started out small, whispers in the hallway, giggles behind her back, and the occasional snide remark. But now, it was relentless. Every day, every class, they found a new way to make her feel like she didn't belong. Cassie, the ringleader of the group, always had a sneer on her face, her blonde hair swishing dramatically as she turned her back on T after every taunt. T tried to keep her composure. She reminded herself that her quietness, her difference, was not something to be ashamed of. But as the harassment intensified, her confidence began to crack. Cassie had even gone so far as to steal her books once, laughing with her friends as T scrambled to pick them up in front of everyone. It was like they were daring her to react, hoping she would snap. But T didn't snap. She couldn't afford to. She had spent years learning to control her emotions, to silence the urges to lash out that burned beneath her skin. Her karate training, which was her secret pride, had always been her escape. She loved the calm, meditative quality of it. The discipline. The focus. But she had learned early on that not everyone understood it. It wasn't normal for a girl like her to be good at something like karate. Her classmates would probably label her a freak, or worse, a show-off if they knew. The thought of it paralyzed her. But that didn't stop the bullies. One day, after lunch, as T walked back to class, she could feel their eyes on her. They were watching her from the far end of the hallway, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She quickened her pace, heart pounding in her chest. But as she turned the corner near the lockers, Cassie's voice rang out. T. Where do you think you're going? She called loudly, her tone sharp with mockery. T froze, her heart racing. She kept her eyes forward, hoping if she ignored them, they would just leave her alone. But Cassie was having none of it. With a group of her friends following behind her, she strutted up to T, blocking her path. I swear, T, you're like a ghost. No one ever sees you. Are you ever going to talk, or are you just going to keep hiding in that shell of yours? Cassie sneered. T kept her head down, silently begging the universe for some kind of escape. But the hallway was crowded now, and she knew the longer she stayed silent, the worse it would get. You know what I think? Cassie continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. I think you're just too weird for this school. Who spends their time being quiet all the time? You don't talk, you don't hang out with anyone. You're just weird, T. T felt her face flush with humiliation, but she kept her mouth shut. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. But she couldn't fight back, not here, not now. Not with everyone watching. Yeah, Cassie's right, one of her friends chimed in, her voice cutting through T's thoughts. Who even is T? Maybe she's a weirdo, like a freak or something, another girl added with a laugh. T's throat tightened. Her stomach churned with a sick, twisting feeling that had become all too familiar. She wished she could disappear. But no matter how much she tried to shrink into herself, they were always there, reminding her, taunting her, making sure she knew her place. The bell rang, signaling the start of the next class, and Cassie gave T one final shove, knocking her into the lockers with enough force to rattle her. See you around, ghost, Cassie spat, her group following her down the hall. T stood there for a moment, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to hold herself together. She could feel the heat of embarrassment burning in her chest, The anger at herself for not being able to do anything. Her mind wandered back to her karate training. She had started when she was 6, after watching an old martial arts movie with her father. She had begged him to teach her, and when he agreed, it became something more than just a hobby. It was a sanctuary. It had helped her through everything: the awkwardness of being an outsider, the challenges of growing up with a father who was rarely around, the loneliness she had always felt. Karate had given her discipline, strength, and the ability to control her emotions. It had shown her the power of defense, not just physical, but mental and emotional. But it also came with an unspoken rule: never fight unless you have to. And T didn't want to have to. She didn't want to be labeled as the girl who fought back, the girl who was too tough for the rest of them. She already knew what that would mean: more bullying, more isolation. But now, as she walked to her next class, the sting of their words still fresh in her mind, she felt something shift inside her. The fear was still there, but so was something else, something sharper, a sense of anger that hadn't been there before. It was during the school assembly that everything came to a head. The gymnasium was packed with students, the air thick with the buzz of chatter as the principal walked up to the podium. T had barely settled into her seat when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around to find Cassie grinning at her, her eyes glinting with malice. "You're gonna love this, T," Cassie called out, loud enough for a few people around them to hear. Before T could respond, the principal's voice cut through the noise, announcing the start of the assembly. Cassie stood up, the loud clatter of her chair hitting the floor drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "T, why don't you get up here and tell everyone why you're always so quiet? I mean, what's the point of even showing up if you're not going to talk to anyone?" Cassie's voice rang out across the gym, her words carrying a weight of cruelty that made T's stomach twist. A few people chuckled. T could feel her heart hammering in her chest, the weight of all those eyes on her pressing down like a suffocating force. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the speaker at the front, but the whispers around her were louder now, impossible to drown out. "Too weird, too quiet, too invisible," Cassie continued, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Maybe we should all just stop pretending, huh, T?" T's vision blurred with the sting of unshed tears. She wanted to scream, to fight back, to show them all that she wasn't what they thought she was. But her hands shook with uncertainty, her mind filled with doubt. She knew what she could do, what she had been trained to do, but the fear of being exposed, of being labeled, held her back. What if they saw her differently? What if they thought she was trying too hard? But in that moment, as the laughter grew louder, something broke. The weight of the words, Cassie's cruel taunts, the whispers, the isolation became too much to bear. T rose from her seat before she even knew what she was doing, her hands trembling at her sides. She turned to Cassie, who was still smiling smugly. T didn't say a word, but the way she looked at her spoke volumes. Then, slowly, she walked toward the edge of the stage, her gaze steady as she focused on the center of the gymnasium. The pressure that had been building inside her, months, years of pain and frustration, was finally coming to a head. T took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't going to hide. She wasn't going to be silent anymore. And for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was time to fight back. T stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection with hollow eyes. Her long black hair hung loosely around her face, but it felt heavier than ever, as if it carried the weight of the entire world. She had spent the last few days pretending like everything was fine, faking smiles in the halls, keeping her head down in class, but inside, she was unraveling. The whispers, the giggles, the constant, relentless mocking from Cassie and her friends, it had all become too much. Today, however, was different. The bell rang to signal the start of lunch, and as T made her way to the restroom to escape the noise of the crowded cafeteria, she thought she might finally find a moment of peace. But as she pushed open the bathroom door, the harsh sound of it slamming against the wall made her stomach drop. Her heartbeat quickened when she saw Cassie leaning against the sink, smirking, flanked by two of her friends. T froze. Well, Cassie said with a mocking lilt in her voice. Look who decided to join us. Her friends, Brianna and Emily, snickered behind her, exchanging knowing glances. There was no escape now. T knew exactly what was coming. She should have turned around and walked out, but something inside her refused to move. Maybe it was the desperation for a break from the endless cycle of torment. Maybe it was the belief, however faint, that, for once, she could stand up for herself. You're such a freak, T, Cassie continued, pushing off from the sink and stepping toward her. I don't even know why you come here. You're so invisible. It's pathetic. T's chest tightened, her breath shallow. She wanted to say something. Anything. Defend herself. Push back. But the words stuck in her throat. Every time she tried, it was like she was choking on them, suffocating under the weight of her own self-doubt. She had always been the quiet girl, the one who kept to herself, the one who never caused trouble. And now, because of it, she was the target. Cassie stepped closer, her voice lower but sharp. I wonder if you even have any friends. Probably not. Who would want to be around someone as boring as you? You don't even talk to anyone. You just hide in corners, pretending you're better than us. The cruel laughter of Cassie's friends echoed in the small, sterile bathroom. T's heart pounded in her ears, drowning out everything else. She could feel the walls closing in, the air thick with suffocating pressure. Look at her, Brianna whispered to Emily. She's like a ghost. Pathetic. T's hands balled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms, but she didn't move. The emotional weight was too heavy. Cassie stepped forward, her breath hot against T's face. You know what I think, she said, her tone mocking. I think you're just scared. Scared to be anything other than nothing. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Nothing. That's what Cassie thought of her. And maybe that's what she was. Maybe that's all she would ever be, nothing. T felt her chest tighten, the familiar sting of tears rising behind her eyes. She tried to blink them back, but it was no use. She couldn't hold it in any longer. The isolation, the taunts, the feeling of being invisible yet constantly scrutinized, it had all been building up, and now, it broke her. She didn't cry out. She didn't yell. But her body collapsed inward, the weight of it all crashing down on her like a wave she couldn't fight. Her breath hitched as she stumbled back, her legs shaking. Cassie's voice softened for a second, but it wasn't kindness, it was a cruel mockery of concern. What's wrong, T? Did I hurt your feelings? You're such a joke. T's knees gave out, and she dropped to the floor, her back pressed against the cold tiles. The tears came then, rivers of frustration and fear, of exhaustion and sadness that she had been holding back for so long. She wanted to disappear. To melt into the floor and never have to face any of this again. Cassie's laughter faded as the group of girls left her alone on the bathroom floor. But their absence didn't bring relief. It only left T with the echoes of their words, of her own fragile sense of self shattering piece by piece. The bell rang again, signaling the end of lunch. By then, T had barely moved. Her sobs had turned into quiet sniffles, and she had managed to collect herself enough to sit up. But the damage was done. She couldn't go back to class. She couldn't face the world, not like this. Instead, she stood slowly and wiped her eyes, still trembling, and left the bathroom. She needed to get away. The sound of footsteps behind her made her pause. She didn't look back, knowing who it was. T, a voice said gently. "Are you okay?" It was Mrs. Turner, the school counselor. T had never gone to her before, never reached out for help, but something in her made the words tumble out now. I don't know how much more I can take." T's voice cracked, and she felt herself break just a little more. Mrs. Turner's expression softened as she stepped closer. "It's okay. It's okay to feel like this. But you don't have to go through it alone." And for the first time in months, T allowed herself to feel safe. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't want to be invisible anymore." Mrs. Turner gently guided her toward the counseling office, where she would sit and talk about everything: the bullying, the emotional weight, the crushing feeling of being unseen. And when it was over, and T was on her way out, she felt something different. Not just relief, but a quiet sense of determination. Later that evening, T sat in her room, staring at the wall. The quiet hum of the night filled the space, but her mind was anything but still. She thought about the tears, about the helplessness she had felt earlier in the bathroom. But then, she thought about something else: the karate classes, the years of training, the strength she had built within herself. Her father had always told her that martial arts wasn't just about fighting, it was about discipline, control, and knowing when to stand up. It was about being strong, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. T had been using her karate skills for years as a way to quiet the noise inside her, to turn her anger and sadness into something productive. But now, those skills were calling her to something else. She couldn't keep running. She couldn't hide anymore. The next day, she would face Cassie. She would stand up for herself, not with fists, but with her voice. It was time for everyone to see her not as the quiet girl in the back of the room, not as the target of bullying, but as someone who had had enough. She was going to reveal her secret. The quiet strength that had always been a part of her. She was going to use it to fight back, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed to the breaking point. T stood in front of her mirror again, looking at herself this time, not as the girl she had been before, but as someone ready to rise above the fear and the pain. A warrior, in her own right. It was time. T stood in front of the school's gymnasium, her breath slow and deliberate, her feet firmly planted on the cracked pavement. The sun had begun to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the campus, but T felt as though time itself had frozen. Her heart pounded, each beat a reminder of the decision she was about to make. It wasn't just a fight; this moment would determine everything that came after. For weeks now, T had been a silent target. Cassie and her group of friends had made her life miserable, constantly finding new ways to humiliate her in front of her classmates. The taunts, the jeers, the snide comments had become a part of her daily routine. She had learned to keep her head down, to shrink into the background, to let the words wash over her like a passing storm. But the storm hadn't stopped. It had only grown. And now, it was her turn to make the storm stop. She didn't know what had changed, Exactly, but something inside her had finally snapped. Maybe it was the endless bullying. Maybe it was the way Cassie and her friends had cornered her one too many times, calling her weak, making fun of her looks, of her awkwardness. Or maybe it was just the way she had always let herself feel like an outsider, like someone who didn't deserve respect. Not anymore. T had always kept her martial arts training a secret, a part of herself she kept hidden even from her closest friends. She had joined karate years ago, to defend herself against the bullying she had been subjected to even back then. But she had never used it outside of class. It had been her escape, her discipline, her solace. She had learned to control her anger, to stay calm, to harness the power of each move. It was a part of her, a skill that kept her grounded, but it had never been tested in a real confrontation, until now. Cassie and her clique were approaching, loud and obnoxious as usual. T had seen them from across the schoolyard, strutting their way toward her like a pack of wolves zeroing in on their prey. She could feel their eyes on her, could almost hear their judgment before they even spoke. "Look who it is," Cassie's voice rang out, shrill and mocking. "The girl who thinks she's too good for us." "What's the matter, T?" Too scared to fight back. T didn't flinch. She had heard this all before. Cassie's entourage snickered behind her, a chorus of laughter that grated on T's nerves. But she stood her ground, facing them with a steely calm that surprised even her. Cassie and the others had always relied on intimidation to get what they wanted. They were used to seeing their victims shrink away, to make them cower before their cruelty. But T wasn't shrinking anymore. T didn't speak at first, allowing the silence to stretch between them like a taut wire. Her hands were clenched into fists by her sides, but they were steady. Her breathing was even. In her mind, she was already in the zone, the calm, controlled space where everything slowed down, where the noise and the distractions faded away. "You think you can hide behind your karate moves, T? You think you're tough just because you take a few classes?" Cassie continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "What are you gonna do, kick us to death?" T didn't answer. She didn't have to. Instead, she shifted her stance, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent. A breath in, a breath out. Her body was already moving before the first word of protest could even leave Cassie's lips. In one smooth motion, T executed a perfect roundhouse kick, the sharp snap of her foot cutting through the air with precision. Cassie didn't even have time to react. The kick landed just a foot away from her, causing her to jump back in surprise. Her eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief. The other girls behind Cassie froze, their laughter dying in an instant. T could feel the energy shift, the fear rippling through the group. She didn't need to look at them. She knew they were all calculating whether or not to challenge her. But T wasn't finished yet. In the blink of an eye, she moved again, this time with a rapid series of jabs, each punch flowing seamlessly into the next. She wasn't hitting them, she wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but the speed and precision of her movements were enough to throw them off balance. She blocked Cassie's attempt to reach for her, pivoted, and with a swift, fluid motion, performed a low sweep kick that sent one of the other girls stumbling backwards, barely catching herself on the grass. The group gasped, the sound of their shock ringing in her ears. "Back off, Cassie," T said, her voice cold, controlled. She had barely spoken, but the power in her words hung in the air, an unspoken challenge. Cassie, humiliated and stunned, stumbled back, her face red with rage and embarrassment. She opened her mouth, but the words she had been about to shout faltered on her lips. Instead, she sneered at T, trying to mask her insecurity with a look of contempt. "You're dead, T," she spat, her eyes burning with fury. "This isn't over. You just made the biggest mistake of your life." T didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had made her point. With one last, controlled movement, a bow of respect, a nod to the discipline she had honed over the years, she turned on her heel and walked away. The crowd of students that had gathered to watch the scene unfold parted, their eyes wide, whispers already beginning to circulate. T didn't look back. She had won. For now. But even as she walked, she knew the victory was fleeting. The weight of Cassie's promise of revenge hung heavy in the air. She could feel it, that pulse of tension that had only just begun. T had revealed her talent to the world not as a fighter, but as someone who wouldn't be pushed around anymore. She had gained respect, yes, but she had also made herself a target. As she reached the gates of the school, T's heart still pounded in her chest. It wasn't just adrenaline, it was something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. She had taken the first step toward standing up for herself, toward demanding respect. But she also knew this was only the beginning. She had made her first strike. T had always been someone who thrived in the quiet. She was content with the simplicity of her life: early mornings at the dojo, quiet afternoons at the library, and evenings spent with Ari, talking about everything and nothing. Her world had been small, centered on the rhythm of her routines, the hum of everyday life. But after the incident, after the fight with Cassie, everything had changed. At first, it was almost surreal, the way things exploded. The moment she stepped onto campus after the fight, it felt like the world had shifted beneath her feet. She had always been an ordinary student, blending into the background, her reputation defined by her skills on the mat rather than her personality. But now, people were looking at her differently. Some students treated her like a hero. They whispered her name with a mix of awe and admiration, eyes wide as if they had witnessed something monumental. T had always been a quiet force, someone who didn't need to prove herself to others. But now, it was as if the very essence of her quietness had been hijacked and turned into something to be worshipped. Others, however, saw her as a threat. A target. The whispers weren't just of admiration, but of fear. Cassie had made sure of that. The rumors spread like wildfire: T was too violent,